Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello there, you are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Times columnist Matthew Syed and the writer and columnist Christina Paterson. So let's see what's on some of those front pages now. Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia have reportedly been offered a new identity with the help of the CIA. That's according to the Sunday Times. The Observer reports £50 million has been secured for funding a new party to break the mould of UK politics. Theresa May U-turns on stop and search, according to the Mail on Sunday, as there's been a spike in shootings and stabbings in the UK's capital. The Sunday Telegraph leads with Amber Rudd as she says the cuts are not to blame for rise in violence. Caught in the act, the headline on the front of the Daily Mirror, as it shows footage of the criminal who was killed by a pensioner he was burgling 2 days before death. Patients flee NHS waiting list hell to seek treatment abroad as the Daily Express leads with the crisis in Britain's hospitals. And we're joined tonight by Matthew Syed and Christina Paterson. Good evening to you both. We're going to kick off with the Sunday Times, its coverage of the Russia spy story and the Skripals, who've made this miraculous recovery, being offered new identities.
And you can sort of understand why they would want that. Conversations between MI6 and the CIA, because I think they know that the Russian state is ruthless. A famous interview where Putin said that traitors would be found and executed. Look at the number of suspicious deaths of Russian dissidents. I mean, including in this country, people in their 30s and 40s going for a jog and dying of a heart attack. Boris Berezovsky found with a ligature around his neck after that trial with Roman Abramovich. They must be... I mean, it's fantastic that they've recovered, and that wasn't something a lot of people were expecting. But their future lives, I think, are going to be extremely difficult, and they will probably, for the rest of their days, live in some kind of fear, so long as Vladimir Putin, bully, effectively a dictator in Russia, is running the show.
It's interesting, isn't it, Christina, because there's been so much focus on their health and whether or not they would survive this and in what kind of condition they would be. But now thinking about, well, if they do come out of hospital, and it looks like Yulia Skripal might be discharged relatively soon, well, what next?
Well, there are conflicting reports in the papers, actually. One, I think in the Mail on Sunday, talks about the possibility of them, or her in particular, being offered, because she's a Russian citizen, being offered, what's it called, asylum, in this country, and then this report, and then this. Up,
I think.
Sorry.
I think we can bring that paper up. The
yeah,
Mail.
and in this report,
new identity to live here.
Yeah, and in this report, it's the US, and I mean, it's a huge thing to happen. She's only 33. To know that you face the rest of your life living in a country that is not your own country, with none of your friends around you, living in fear of your life, having to pretend, having to wipe out your entire identity, that's an enormous thing. And it's yet another sign of how utterly ruthless Putin and his henchmen are. And I have to say that, I mean, it's very hard for us to, you know, the usual diplomatic moves have been taken, which is, you know, various spies have been, and diplomats have been banned in one country, and then, of course, it's tit for tat, and none of that, I think, is particularly effective. I think what is effective, or relatively effective, is hitting Putin and his henchmen where it hurts, which is in their wallets, and that, amazingly enough, is what Donald Trump has done this week. America's taken really radical action against some of the oligarchs who are closest to Putin, some of whom are active in the Russian government. And these are, you know, nasty people, and they have essentially stolen their money from the Russian people. All of this happened post Yeltsin, when, you know, thank you, when utilities were basically creamed off and a few individuals became enormously wealthy at the expense of the Russian people. And they wield their power like emperors, but also very often with the kind of killings and threats of violence that Matthew's talked about. I mean, it's a rogue nation, actually, and no wonder Putin is backing Assad in the Syrian war, because they are two of a kind. They are absolutely brutal, ruthless people. And of course, Assad has power in Syria, but Putin has demonstrated he has huge global power. And I think we have reason to be very frightened.
I mean, it is worth... I mean, the perspective here is interesting because in the trial between Abramovich and Berezovsky, Jonathan Sumption, who's the QC for Abramovich, did state in open court that the auctions had been rigged, that there was essentially a quid pro quo where Yeltsin was given free advertising on the oligarchs' television channels in return for an auction that sold off the wealth of the Russian nation at a knockdown price. Now, this kind of corruption is now endemic in Russian society. There's no independent judiciary. You know, the executive, Putin, runs that country and people live in fear of him, controls the television channels now. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The only way to send a message, a compelling message to somebody like that and the cronies who are engorging themselves through kickbacks and other corrupt practices is by targeting their Western-held assets. Now, the United States, they passed a Magnitsky Clause a while ago. This is for human rights violators. I mean, I argued in a column 3 weeks ago we should have a beefed-up version that targets property owned by these individuals if they cannot explain how they got their wealth legitimately. It seems to me that is perfectly in accordance with due process. They'll never get targeted in Russian courts because the courts are run by the executive branch.
Just interestingly, at the bottom of the Mail there, a story about Yulia Skripal's boyfriend or fiancé, it's not quite clear, and potential links to the Russian...
Well, this is an intriguing little story that we just noticed before we came on air, which is that apparently her fiancé is called Stepan Vikev, and he and his mother are said to have links with the Russian intelligence service. And his mother, apparently, did not want her son to marry the daughter of a traitor. So clearly his mother has bought into this Putin narrative that he is a traitor, and we all know what happens to traitors.
Kick the bucket, I think, were the words of Vladimir Putin.
Exactly. And so that is a kind of, well, it's yet another twist in a tale that is beyond fiction, really.
Let's move to another story now on the front of the Sunday Times, and this is gender pay at the BBC.
Yeah, this is Sarah Montague, the excellent presenter of the Today programme. She's actually just left to go to The World at One. And she's furious. She's really, really angry that she found out that she was earning a relatively small proportion of her male colleagues when the BBC were forced to publish what their presenters were earning, and she was on $133,000 a year. It's quite a lot of money, frankly, but she didn't realise that John Humphrys was on $600,000, and she says that this is going to affect her for the rest of her life because it also has downstream consequences for her pension. But it's in this week, isn't it, where we've been talking a lot about gender pay, and I think it's symbolic of a problem. I think what we haven't quite drilled down into yet in this conversation is how to resolve the problem.
Oh, it's very, very difficult to resolve, and it looks as though there's been a fair bit of massaging of the figures, actually, because they don't. The various statisticians have talked about how there should be a median, and they're just a bit skewed. So I think it looks as though either HR departments or their, in-house, whoever it is who's paid to present this information has done a kind of spin job on a lot of it. And as we said before, it's a very complicated issue. But I have to say, I'm a huge fan of Sarah Montague's. I love her tone on the Today programme. I think she's fierce, but she's nice. She's warm and she's forensic. And it's not all about her. She doesn't have that kind of ego thing going. And I think it's very brave of her to write about this because, for a start, as you say, Matthew, earning 133, well, the average salary in this country is about 26 grand. So that's, more than 5 times the average salary. So obviously you're likely to get slagged off for being very privileged, which she is in relation to most people. However, if your colleague who's doing exactly the same job is earning 4 or 5 times as much as you, that is galling. And I think when you speak out about this kind of thing as a woman, you constantly get told that you're hysterical and you're shrieking and you're feisty and you're a harridan. And we have to speak out about it because it's not right. So good for her.
And she says that it was professionally damaging and it made her feel like a sap being paid so much less than her male colleagues. staying with the Mail, and we're going to look at a story about Operation Rescue Rubens. What can you tell us about this?
Well, it's...
Rescue Rubens. Go on, quick. What can you tell us about this?
Well, Christina, enlighten us.
This painting, called Head of an African Man Wearing a Turban, which is a Reuben, painted in 1609, has been sold by a kind of... an aristocrat who lives in Norfolk, apparently called Count Luca Padulli, who doesn't want much publicity. It's been sold to the Getty Museum in LA for, I think it's 71 million, and
yes.
No, 7 million, sorry. And
yes,
and
the 71 million was for 16 artworks.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And the arts minister, Michael Ellis, is trying to save it for the nation. And I think it probably should be. I went on Monday to the Charles I exhibition at the Royal Academy, and there were several Rubens in that. And, you know, Rubens, obviously, many of his paintings are masterpieces. It is a completely wonderful exhibition. If any of you get the chance to go and see it, do.
But how do you decide? I mean, you sit around in the room saying, right, is it worth 7 million?
Well, you get these things...
How do they work,
you get these things called experts, which obviously nobody likes.
I was going to say, we really are not.
That'll be helpful. Yeah, it's worth 10, I would say. What do you reckon?
It's not
5.
About... you can't... It's not about, you know, a kind of arbitrary valuation. It's about whether these things are worth keeping in the country. And the argument that they are putting forward is that this is historically a very important painting.
When he says saving it for the nation, spending taxpayers' money, right?
Well,
it's not spending its own.
Matthew, I get the impression you're not a fan.
Well, do you know, I think we've got a rich cultural heritage which we protect, but I do sometimes worry that art galleries are a subsidy to the middle classes.
I sometimes worry you don't go to enough art galleries.
Perhaps you can
watch less football and go to more exhibitions.
You won't let me talk about football on the paper review.
From Christina. We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, actually. Violent news should face social media ban. That is on the front of The Observer. We'll be discussing it next. Hello, welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview with me now, the Times columnist Matthew Syed and the writer and columnist Christina Paterson. The Mail has a story about the recent spike in knife crime and a controversial intervention by Trevor Phillips.
I don't think it's that controversial. I mean, he's describing it as such because he's saying that there should be more use of stop and search. But that is something that a lot of very enlightened police chiefs are saying too. Sarah Thornton wrote a first-person piece last week, head of the Chief Constable's Council, saying that the practice of stop and search is an indispensable part of policing, as long as it's used in a judicious way. And I think that what Trevor Phillips is saying is that if you're from an ethnic minority background in a crime hotspot and you are somebody who doesn't commit crime, then you want to see the police intervening and going after people who might be carrying a weapon, so long as they've got probable cause. I mean, I know it has been used in a way in the past that has been discriminatory, but I think, with the right safeguards in place, it can be a very powerful force for good in what is a complex social phenomenon that needs other remedies too.
Well, it is actually very controversial, and not least because our Prime Minister was one of the key people who cut back on it. And, I mean, it's just such a heartbreaking issue, this whole thing, and I live in Hackney, where people are dying all the time, and we've matched New York in terms of murders already this year. In fact, we've outpaced New York. Yeah. It is difficult because it is also the case, and I think this is a photograph of a young man who spoke at the Tory party conference in 2014, who had been stopped and searched more than 20 times despite having no criminal history. And I've spoken to a lot of young people who have found that being constantly stopped and searched by the police just because they're black, when they had no criminal background, in the end creates very bad relations with the police. So it is a very complicated issue. However, on balance, I think that Trevor Phillips is right. I think however well-meaning it is to cut back on not want to be seen to be apparently discriminating against young black or mixed-race men, the fact is that if most of the crime is happening in areas where there are a lot of young black and mixed-race men, I think you have to increase the pace where the knives are.
And The Observer has a story about one of the other potential measures to try and cut down on knife crime.
Yeah.
It's a social media ban.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. people are glamorising violence, and this is having an influence on the psychology of young people. I think it's absolutely right that if you've been convicted of a crime, then you should be banned from the social media.
How would you
implement it? Don't know, but that's a good question. Just circling back briefly, I mean, it's worth saying that the London crime rate has been going down for a very, very long time. It's these 2 months where it's matched New York, but it may well be that that is a blip. Moreover, the number of homicides per 1,000 of population is a lot lower in London than it is in Greater Manchester and many other parts of the country. And it is typically concentrated in particular areas where there is gang culture. I think we mustn't... It's an absolute... The tragedies that have been happening are harrowing, but I do think we should place them in some context as well. OK, we haven't got long left, but let's end on a lighter note with some images of Prince Charles, the new High Chief of Vanuatu, in the Express. Very interesting pictures of Prince Charles wearing a grass skirt here. No, it's page 3 of the Express, if we can get that. Here we are. Look, here he is.
Yes. Well, he has gone to Vanuatu, which I seem to remember has been classified as, if not the happiest place in the world, one of the happiest places in the world. And
above the Sky News studio.
Above the Sky News studio,
yes, on a Saturday night.
Close,
but
right?
They haven't done close surveys of here. Depends who you're on with, Matthew. But in Vanuatu, a religion was established in the 1950s which did actually involve worshipping Prince Philip. And so, as the honoured son of Prince Philip, he's getting a particularly warm reception at the moment and was given this lovely phallic statue.
Yes. Which, I wonder if he'll fit that in his suitcase. Christina, Matthew, that's all we've got time for. Thank you both very much indeed for taking us through Sunday's papers.
So now to the papers, and lots of interesting stuff this morning. There's the Observer's front page, £50 million backing for a new party to break the mould of UK politics. Will it actually happen? Inside Andrew Rawnsley, their columnist, is a bit sceptical, but an interesting story to talk about. There's the Sunday Express saying that a lot of people are fleeing Britain to get medical treatment in hospitals abroad, and a picture of Prince Charles in Australia looking slightly odd. Then there's the Sunday Telegraph. Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, picking up on that very, very important story all week about the stabbings and the shootings, saying there are enough bobbies on the beat, it's all right, and she's got a new task force. We'll be talking about that with Sajid Javid later in the programme. And then there's the Sunday Times with Sarah Montague, cross about the pay gap, a very good piece she's written inside about that. But also their main story, the Skripals, Sergei and Yulia, being offered new identities, they say. With CIA help, they're going to disappear off to America and become different people. They are both presumably talking to the authorities, so we'll know more about that, much more, and we're going to be talking about that as well in the paper review. And finally, there's the Mail on Sunday, again talking about the knife crime issue. Theresa May made it tougher for the police to stop and search people randomly, but she has changed her mind, it claims, on that. I'm not absolutely sure that every syllable of that story totally justifies the headlines, Mail on Sunday, but very interesting. Well done. Thank you very much. Anyway, we're going to start off talking about the Skripals, I think, Julia, yes?
Yes, absolutely.
It's an amazing story, this, isn't it?
Well, 5 weeks on, it is extraordinary. And the fact that this is also obviously front-page news in Russia, as we've been discovering this week, with the niece of Sergei Skripal on the television virtually every night.
I mean, a few weeks ago, to be ghoulish about it, would be not to be ghoulish about it, we thought they were dying.
I mean, that was what was being said at the hospital.
And they'd never regained consciousness, and now they're talking.
Yeah, absolutely extraordinary. And thank goodness. And thank goodness also for the police officer as well, who could have also possibly lost his life. But this is the interesting thing. I think the more interesting thing about this is not that actually the idea that the Americans could help with offering alternative identities and a new life in America, much easier to protect them. The concern being they have to be in a Five Eyes country, one of our biggest sort of staunchest allies, that we know that we can keep them safe.
But Five Eyes.
Five Eyes. Well, you know,
What's
yes,
Five
it's
Eyes?
Five Eyes. It's basically the Anglosphere to all intents and purposes. But it's interesting that the Russians are demanding to meet with Yulia now she's awake. Yulia apparently doesn't want to meet with them, and of course we know yesterday the niece's visa hasn't been granted. But it is interesting what Boris Johnson has said, because we had some extraordinary scenes this week at the Russian embassy with the Russian ambassador playing sort of comical alley. We were back to Iraq, Baghdad.
It was very bizarre.
Yes, there's nothing to see here while the bombs are dropping behind
What Boris is writing today in the papers, trying to
This is the Sunday Times.
It's in the Sunday Times, trying to exculpate himself. He has bungled yet again on one of the most crucial diplomatic. He is the most undiplomatic.
He doesn't do detail, and Foreign Office requires, well, all politics requires detail.
Lazy, sloppy. Never reads his brief. You think what he's done to the Iranian captive.
Just to remind people, what we're talking about here is that there was an interview with the guy heading Porton Down, and he said, yes, we have
Which
identified
was also a car
this.
crash interview.
Yes, we've identified this as Novichok. We don't know where it came from. And that seemed to contradict what Boris Johnson had told German television, where he said they were absolutely categorical.
No, he'd spoken to the guy at Porton Down.
His words absolutely categorical. There wasn't actually a question there.
He said, this guy, no question about it. And the handling of, as we know, the handling of sensitive intelligence information is so important. You get it wrong, you discredit everything.
But it's interesting that the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, isn't even given the most sensitive information because he's not. It's not thought.
Well, what's interesting is that Boris Johnson here is trying to put the blame onto Corbyn. I mean, Corbyn is not the story in this. Whether he acted well or badly, he's not the story. He's calling him infantile and a Kremlin's useless idiot, useful idiot. The story has been this week the idiocy of Boris Johnson.
Look, I absolutely agree. I think absolutely total incompetence from Boris Johnson. I wouldn't have him in the job in the first place. But the reality is, when you have the official leader of Her Majesty's opposition basically spouting Kremlin lines on this issue, I don't think it's not irrelevant.
I'm nervously and worriedly going to not stand up for him, but just put the other side of the case, which is that in that German TV interview, it wasn't clear that he was saying it was absolutely categorical that it had come from Russia. He was saying it was absolutely categorical that it was Novichok, which is what the Porton Down guy said. So to that extent, it wasn't actually a slip. The trouble is that any possible syllable slipping one way or another, the Russians are so aggressive they just dive straight in.
And they've been able to exploit that on social media and on their own media.
And of course, it was very perilous because we have a coalition which has been terrific of people supporting us, of countries, allies, friends supporting us. You know, Boris put that at risk.
Okay, Julia, you have a tablet there. And you're going to tell us about something else the Russians have been up to.
Well, indeed. And again, let's all be terribly surprised at the idea, are the Russians using chemical weapons? Well, they're backing a Syrian regime which is using chemical weapons. It's believed overnight this attack on civilians in eastern Ghouta, leading, of course, all the news broadcasts today.
A hideous story.
Yeah, I mean, this is the Guardian copy from earlier this morning saying 41 dead. It looks like, I think, 70 possibly, and many, many hundreds more. Again, targeting innocent civilians, children hit in this chemical attack. We've got to stop the nonsense that they are not using chemical weapons. They are using them. And of course, I have to say, I do think we need to remember that it was our country that chose not to get involved even after chemical weapons attacks as a result of votes in Parliament led by former Labour leader Ed Miliband.
The Middle East is aflame again. I mean, there's lots of Palestinian kids being killed further south as well by the Israeli forces.
But these are lessons. We learnt lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan of what happens when we do it, when we get involved and get it wrong. Well, now we've learnt about what happens when we don't get involved and get it wrong.
Let's move to the big domestic story, Polly. That's the Sunday Telegraph and Amber Rudd talking about knife crime.
The horrors of the recent murders on the streets, kids killing each other, not just in London, but London's taken the main focus of it recently, but in fact it's all over the place. There's Amber Rudd trying to say having cut the police by 20% is irrelevant, which is hard to believe, but also coming up with some quite good practical suggestions for restricting access to horror knives.
Zombie knives, weird-looking knives.
Weird-looking things, and indeed acid, and that's all quite sensible. But in the end, the police themselves have said, you know, this is a social question. The London police have said this is a social question. You cannot expect the police to come in and mop up after profound social problems, which are about the huge cuts in youth services. One of the first things to go in 2010, but vast cuts in youth services, even those programmes specifically targeted at gangs and preventing kids getting into gangs. Also mental health. You look at, you know, children and adolescent mental health has taken the biggest cut, and that's where you have to get them early on. Every programme that might draw kids away from being pulled into local gangs has been cut to pieces.
I think there are massive social questions, and I don't think that the number of police officers on the street necessarily makes a difference to whether someone thinks that if someone slights them on Instagram, that it's appropriate to then go and stab them, which is where we are. No, but there are two other big issues. One is total abject failure at schools. A lot of young lads who end up in gangs at 13, 14 have been failed long ago. We need to be intervening far, far earlier. They're leaving primary school semi-literate.
I think it's very hard to expect teachers to solve this enormous social problem. People put it on schools and they put it on the police.
No, I'm not putting it on schools. I'm saying also we can't keep ignoring the abject breakdown of family units. There will not be a father in a single one of these homes.
The other big issue here, of course, in terms of tactics, is stop and search. And there's a very interesting piece by Trevor Phillips, who was the Equal Opportunities Commission there. Talking about stop and search.
He's making a point I've been making all week that, you know, it's not middle-class white kids who are being stabbed or doing the stabbing. It's black working-class kids. You know, look, it would have been dealt with much quicker if it was our kids who were getting stabbed. It would have been dealt with last week.
Theresa May changed, in some respects, behaved in quite a kind of liberal way, because a lot of black kids in particular felt that stop and search, the old sus laws, were very, very oppressive.
Well, no, they didn't feel it. It was absolutely the case. I mean, post-Macpherson and institutional racism. No, but I've spoken to black reverends who get searched every week in their 60s. No doubt at all there are some racist police who do that, and we needed to tackle that. But the reality is, this sort of street crime is black-on-black street crime. You're going to have to be searching black kids.
And you need a sense of deterrence. Kids need to think that if I put a knife down my trousers and walk out, I might be stopped, I might be caught.
Possibly, but what actually happened was that 92% of those who were stopped and searched had no weapons on them. And the resentment that was stirred in that community, you know, helped the gang culture, helped all of the things, antisocial, anti-police attitudes.
Right. But also, if you're more scared actually of someone stabbing you than you are of the police.
Theresa May was right about this, and she hasn't done, as the Mail suggests, a huge U-turn. They're saying we're going to target, which I think everybody thinks that's right, certain areas, certain gang places, certain people who are particularly suspect.
Now, Polly, I have you here as one of the founder creators of the old SDP, and in that context I need to talk to you about the Observer's front page story. Lots and lots of money, 50 million quid for a new party of the centre, pro-European, pro-redistribution. It sounds a little familiar to me.
Certainly sounds very familiar to me. They're even using breaking the mould, which was our 1980s. And we never broke the mould, because the mouldy old mould is unbreakable for as long as you have our appalling electoral system that doesn't allow, I mean, ask UKIP, it does not allow newcomers in at all. So I think there is not a hope in hell of this getting anywhere. Incidentally, nor is a single leading politician, any politician.
There's nobody associated with it at this
Nobody
stage.
dares be associated with it, because it's a toxic.
But if Brexit and Corbyn were about the people rising up against the elite and the establishment, £50 million from multi-millionaires is not going to play very well with the electorate.
We're slightly running out of time, but I'd like to do a couple more stories. The War Boys business. A politician saying that he's to blame. That's interesting.
This is really extraordinary. Actually, an interview in the Sun on Sunday, David Gauke, the Justice Secretary, of course, he's the one who took legal advice and chose not to challenge that Paul Boyd decision on John Warboys, the black cab rapist, being released around now he would be released. But he said, okay, it was my call, and he said, we must learn the lessons, and he said, it was my responsibility. It's very rare to actually have a politician.
How rare? He's a very decent man, Gauke, and I think we could have a lot more of that from politicians.
Okay, before we finish, we need to get to the Mark Zuckerberg story, because we're going to be talking about that in a moment. All over the front page of The Observer, lots of questions for him to answer.
Carol Cadwallader, the brilliant journalist who has brought the whole issue to light, together with
Didn't enjoy her time on the sofa last week, I recall.
Well, indeed.
I believe she left the studio crying, didn't she?
No, she didn't do that, but she wasn't very happy.
I can't think why, because she is one of our great journalists. And she's put here all of the questions that Mark Zuckerberg should answer if he were to agree to come before the House of Commons. And the most important one of those, of course, is about the referendum. Who saw Facebook adverts during the referendum and why? We need to know that. We need to know what went on behind the scenes, how serious it was, how important it was.
If you can do it very, very quickly, the pay gap.
Yes, the gender pay gap.
Huge, if I may say so to the Sunday Times, a slightly confusing piece of graphic information there.
Yes, indeed.
An impressive amount of information gathered together nonetheless.
The biggest story of the week, and I note, obviously, that we're making up the gender quota for expert commentators at the BBC today.
Thank you both very much.
Nice to be invited for that and not for actually our views, but there we are. But this is the thing, where are you in the gender pay gap? I mean, I just think an awful lot of this is a load of nonsense, totally ignoring people's age, the fact that people work part-time, the fact that people go into different jobs. And at the end of the day, you're only going to have an absolutely zero pay gap if we just tell people the jobs they have to do and how many hours they have to work.
I couldn't disagree more. This is about the fundamental question of how women are treated and whether having children is something that falls upon women and their future careers forever.
I definitely remember giving birth to my child, not my husband. I'm pretty sure about that. And he was rubbish at breastfeeding. He was absolutely useless at it.
We have run out of time. Thank you both very much indeed.
Time now to dive into the Sunday papers. Joining me to discuss it all, the Deputy Political Editor of HuffPost UK, Owen Bennett, the Communications Guru, Joe Tanner, and the Editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Stephen Pollard. Good morning to all of you. Let's dive on in. And Stephen, your choice is an interesting one. The Telegraph, page 24. Peter Tatchell's given a pretty revealing interview to Simon Heffer.
He has. The great thing about Peter Tatchell, I mean, it's an interview that's really worth reading. He talks about all kinds of things that have happened to him in the past and about politics today and his general sympathy for Jeremy Corbyn, but the fact that he's utterly bewildered and depressed by the whole anti-Semitism row. But the reason I've chosen it is that it's a very personal reason. I think Peter Tatchell is one of the great unheralded figures of the last 30 years. He's a man who has stood up for his principles in the most incredible way, getting beaten up by thugs from Robert Mugabe, standing up to Vladimir Putin. And you know, when he first stood for Parliament in the '83 Bermondsey by-election, he was subject to the most appalling homophobic campaign. You know, he was so far ahead of his time. He was a sort of out gay figure even in 1983. And I just think he's one of the great figures. He's a sort of hero of mine. And I have a very sort of low-level campaign. I think he should be in the House of Lords. I think he should be. He's exactly the type of person that we should have in that kind of upper chamber atmosphere. I
mean, he's certainly a very articulate advocate, particularly for gay rights, but on a number of injustice campaigns. But are we all as sanguine about the way in which Stonewall behaved, you know, back in the 80s, and the way in which they outed a number of very prominent politicians, admittedly because of the way in which they were voting on equal rights?
And I wonder if, looking back, you know, some people, when you get into your latter years and you think perhaps some of the stuff we did wasn't quite the way to do it, but the cause was worth it. And that's the thing that I think when you look back, you know, Peter's a very controversial character to many, but I have some sympathy with Stephen's point. I think, you know, the idea of someone like this appearing in the Lords and shaking things up a bit might not be the worst things to have happened.
Stephen mentioned there the anti-Semitism issue, and clearly it's something that Peter Tatchell has spoken a number of times. Where are we today in the Labour anti-Semitism saga? Because for once, the newspapers are not chock full of allegations.
Well, I haven't checked for about 10 minutes, so it might have all changed with these things. I think we're at the situation now, I think Jeremy is going to meet some of the more, should we say, mainstream elements of the British Jewish community. I think that, it seems to me that the main Labour Party are sort of holding their breath, waiting to see what Jeremy does next. I think he's at a situation now where, having gone to the Judas event last week, and that was criticised as not so much for going, but being the first thing you go to after this big row, I think they're waiting to see what his next move is. I think if he is able to sort of deal with the fears and the concerns of those in the sort of mainstream Jewish community, I think some people will say, yes, he is learning.
Yeah, and the fact it's not on the front pages of the Sundays this time, I mean, it's something of a communications victory for them. Joe, shall we go inside the Sun on Sunday, and an interesting admission from the Justice Secretary?
Yeah, I was just really struck by this because it's not the sort of stuff we see every day, so I felt like it was worth mentioning. Dave Wooding of the Sun on Sunday has had an interview with David Gauke, the Justice Secretary, who wasn't sure for a while if he was going to last in the job after the War Boys controversy. And it's a really interesting piece. It's a very striking sort of picture of David Gauke kind of leaning in, and the headline, "I'm to blame," where he essentially says that he took advice on the War Boys case and the issue of the decision by the parole board to release him, and essentially said, look, I made the decision. I accept responsibility. It wasn't right, and it's my responsibility entirely. He even goes as far as to say in the piece, I'm not hiding behind my advisors, which for a politician is quite refreshing.
Refreshing, but he's out of the danger zone now. I mean, isn't he essentially saying that he probably should have stepped down if he's taking responsibility for it?
But I think the issue with this whole case was that it was a complete mess. What was going on behind the scenes, nobody quite knows. The decision that was made by the parole board, people still don't quite know what's gone on there because obviously it's all shrouded in secrecy, which is also part of the problem. But he goes on actually in this to delve into other areas that, as Justice Secretary, he has to deal with. So it's not just about those big high-profile cases. It's also about what's going on in prisons, which obviously with the concerns about knife crime, you know, it might be one thing about sentencing, but actually what happens to people when they do offend and then they're supposed to be rehabilitated.
I mean, there's one interesting lesson from the whole War Boys thing, which is it's another example of the role of the free press. Because if it wasn't for, well, the incredibly brave victims who came together and spoke out and helped to fund the judicial review, but it was the Sun, and to a lesser extent the Daily Mail, which funded quite a lot of this and went for the judicial review. And, you know, it's another example of how important our free press is.
And individuals like myself, I contributed to the campaign. I saw it and was outraged by it and felt it was worth contributing to.
Let's go then on to our last story today. And Owen, this is again, it's a fascinating piece. This is immigration. Go on, take us
It's
through.
Dominic Raab, who's the housing minister. He's basically said that immigration, he says, has put up... He's seen advice from civil servants that immigration has put up house prices by something like 20% in the last 25 years.
I thought the pressure on the housing market came from the top end.
Okay, well, it's an astonishing claim, and I'd really like to see the figures, how they've calculated that, because I'm not sure how you could do that. I mean, it acknowledges that immigration has benefits to the construction sector and all those kind of things, but he's writing to the Migration Advisory Committee to consider the negative effects of new arrivals on housing demands. I'm surprised that Dominic Raab's done this. Dominic Raab is a man who's seen as a future leader. He's a very eloquent man. He's a very intelligent man. And I feel like the immigration debate hasn't really flared up again since the referendum. Obviously, it was dominating then. This kind of thing could flare it up again, actually, these kind of claims. Obviously, he's maybe taken a bit of a calculation here that perhaps he feels like that it's not being addressed again, and in not addressing it, that could once again fuel people on the much more to the right to use it as a stick to beat the establishment with.
Well, listen, as Owen was saying there, I mean, this type of thing has been said before, but I've not seen the data that backs it up. I mean, Dominic Raab, rising star within the Conservative ranks, is this a fight that he needs to pick right now? A point that he needs to make?
It's maybe not a point that he needs to make, but we're now sitting here talking about Dominic Raab. And you said yourself, he's a rising star within the Conservative Party. A lot of people think he may potentially be the next leader. And here we are talking about a junior minister. You know, to that extent, it's working, isn't it?
I mean, he was overlooked. The kind of consensus appeared to be that he was on the cusp of getting a cabinet post. But for whatever reason, and some suggest that perhaps, you know, the Prime Minister didn't want to have any kind of high-profile young candidates being put into cabinet positions. I mean, should he have been promoted, Jo?
I think there was, well, the question of who should be promoted. I mean, there's a finite number of seats, and actually with Dominic...
Finite amount of talent, you might say, as well.
But also, you know, with Dominic, this argument about the housing position actually being a cabinet position has been argued for some time, and instead we saw this change in the department's name to have housing right up there as now the ministry rather than a department. But, you know, interestingly, Dominic here is talking about immigration, he's talking about the figures and the immigration targets, which takes him straight back onto Theresa May's original agenda, given that number of how many people are coming in is still the centre of much politics and will be for some time.
I suspect we will be hearing a lot more about and from Dominic Raab in the weeks and months to come. Guys, thanks very much for coming in.